As 1943 drew to a close, the Eastern Front was undergoing profound transformation. The German Wehrmacht, reeling from the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad and the failure of Operation Citadel at Kursk, found itself gradually forced into a defensive posture. Soviet forces, buoyed by increasing strategic initiative and growing material superiority, were executing a series of large-scale offensives aimed at liberating occupied territories and destroying enemy formations in Ukraine. Against this volatile backdrop, the region west of Kiev became the site of a critical winter operation that would come to be known as the Battle of Jitomir-Berdichev. The geopolitical importance of Ukraine had long been recognized by both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. It served as a vital agricultural and industrial base, a transportation nexus, and a strategic bridgehead for deeper operations into Central and Eastern Europe. For the Germans, maintaining control over right-bank Ukraine was essential not only for sustaining logistical networks, but also for defending the southern flank of Army Group Center and securing the route to Romania's oil fields. For the Soviets, the liberation of this region was both a military imperative and a symbolic blow against the occupation, reinforcing their forward momentum after the recapture of Kiev in early November 1943. Following the Soviet liberation of the Ukrainian capital, the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, sought to capitalize on German disarray by launching a deeper thrust into German-held territories. The Southwestern Front, under General Rodion Malinovsky, and the First Ukrainian Front, commanded by General Nikolai Vatutin, were tasked with continuing the offensive across a broad front. Their goal was to exploit the gaps between German Army Group South and Army Group Center, drive westward through Zhitomir and Berdichev, and ultimately threaten the Dnieper River line and the rear positions of Army Group A in the south. German command structures, meanwhile, were undergoing significant stress. Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, was tasked with stabilizing the front while holding key positions in Ukraine. In response to the Soviet capture of Kiev, Manstein launched a counteroffensive in mid-November, retaking Zhitomir and attempting to encircle Soviet forces. However, these tactical gains proved temporary. While the German operational doctrine still emphasized mobility and counterstrike, the realities of attrition, overstretched lines, and deteriorating morale increasingly undermined the Wehrmacht's ability to conduct sustained offensive operations. The winter of 1943-44 added another layer of complexity to the unfolding events. Harsh weather conditions turned roads into impassable quagmires, severely hampering supply convoys and mechanized movement on both sides. Equipment failures, frostbite, and logistical bottlenecks became constant challenges. Yet Soviet industrial production, now relocated and consolidated east of the Ural Mountains, had reached levels sufficient to sustain multi-front operations despite adverse conditions. T-34 tanks rolled off the assembly lines in record numbers, and Lend-Lease supplies from the Allies bolstered Soviet transport and communication networks. The morale of Soviet troops was further enhanced by successive battlefield victories. Propaganda organs emphasized the liberation of Ukrainian cities and the drive toward national recovery. For many Red Army soldiers of Ukrainian origin, the operations held deeply personal significance as they advanced through their own ravaged homelands. Conversely, the German side faced growing disillusionment. The failure to decisively halt the Soviet advance at Kursk and the attritional nature of recent battles eroded confidence in victory. Command cohesion was further strained by conflicting directives from Hitler, who frequently intervened in operational planning, insisting on holding untenable positions. Within this environment, both sides began preparing for the next phase of confrontation. The Soviet plan centered on a deep operation designed to encircle and destroy German forces west of the Dnieper. The First Ukrainian Front was to advance through Jitomir and Berdichev, isolating the German Exlet and 13 Army Corps. To support this push, Soviet engineers rapidly rebuilt destroyed railways and bridges, allowing for better troop and equipment movement in an otherwise logistically hostile terrain. On the German side, preparation was less methodical. Despite intelligence warnings of a large-scale Soviet buildup, command remained uncertain about the exact direction of the Soviet strike. Hitler's insistence on defending Kiev and the surrounding region at all costs further limited Manstein's freedom of maneuver. Reinforcements were sparse and poorly coordinated, while armored units were increasingly tied down in counterattacks or held in reserve far from the threatened sectors. The Luftwaffe's diminished capabilities offered little support, and German lines were increasingly porous, with overstretched infantry divisions unable to fully secure the vast front. As the final weeks of December approached, Soviet preparations neared completion. Ammunition and fuel stockpiles were moved into forward depots, artillery was positioned to support breakthroughs, and assault infantry brigades were concentrated at key nodes. A sense of anticipation gripped the Soviet command structure. The coming operation was not merely another step in the broader strategic offensive, but a calculated move to break the last remaining resistance west of Kiev and accelerate the liberation of western Ukraine. By contrast, German forces waited in uncertainty. The terrain between the Teterev and Nilopyat rivers, with its forests, marshes, and winter-thickened ground, promised defensive advantages, but only if sufficient manpower and coordination could be brought to bear. As snow fell across the region, concealing troop movements and muting artillery fire, the stage was set for a brutal confrontation. The Jitomir-Berdichev operation would unfold not as a sudden clash, but as a calculated and grueling struggle, pitting strategy against desperation and winter cold against blood and steel. In the early hours of December 24, 1943, under heavy cloud cover and falling snow, the Red Army launched its coordinated offensive west of Kiev. The First Ukrainian Front, led by General Nikolai Vatutin, initiated a broad and calculated assault along a wide front stretching from Radomyshl in the north to the vicinity of Kazatin in the south. This marked the formal beginning of the Jitomir-Berdichev offensive, intended to dislodge the German 4th Panzer Army and recapture critical urban and logistical centers that anchored the German defense in right bank Ukraine. The initial thrust came from the 1st Guards Army and the 18th Army, supported by the 3rd Guards Tank Army under General Pavel Rybalko. These formations moved swiftly through snow-covered terrain, exploiting weak spots in the German defensive lines. Soviet artillery had spent the prior day shelling key German positions, softening resistance before the main assault. Meanwhile, reconnaissance units had mapped German strongpoints and identified gaps between formations, allowing Soviet armor to spearhead through less fortified sectors. Rapid advances were made in multiple directions, with Soviet tanks pushing toward Zhitomir from the northwest and simultaneously toward Berdichev from the southeast. The German 4th Panzer Army, under the command of General Hermann Hoth, was caught in an unfavorable posture. In the preceding weeks, its formations had been weakened by the redeployment of key units to other sectors and ongoing clashes around Kiev and Korostin. Although local commanders had received intelligence indicating a Soviet buildup, they underestimated the scale and timing of the offensive. The German 13 and X-11 Army Corps, positioned in a thin arc around Jitomir and Berdichev, were forced into rapid and chaotic defensive action. Initial Soviet gains were significant. Towns such as Radomyshl and Brusilov fell within the first days of the offensive, as German resistance buckled under the weight of concentrated artillery fire and deep penetration tank units. Soviet infantry, riding on the backs of tanks or trudging behind in white camouflage, cleared pockets of resistance with grenades and submachine guns. The local civilian population, many of whom had lived under occupation for over 2 years, emerged cautiously as Soviet flags were raised over administrative buildings and rail yards. By December 27th, Soviet forces had reached the outskirts of Zhitomir, threatening to encircle the German defenders. In response, German High Command rushed reinforcements into the sector, including elements of the elite 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte, and the 1st Panzer Division. These units were tasked with halting the Soviet advance and mounting counteroffensives to stabilize the front. Despite their experience and better equipment, the reinforced German units found themselves hindered by deteriorating roads, fuel shortages, and the overwhelming weight of Soviet numbers. Command coordination on the German side also proved increasingly problematic. Field Marshal von Manstein, operating from Army Group South headquarters, was under intense pressure from Hitler to hold key cities at all costs. Hitler's directives forbade tactical withdrawals or realignment of positions, even when encirclement loomed. This rigid command structure severely limited the ability of field commanders to respond flexibly to the evolving battlefield conditions. Orders to stand fast led to the destruction or entrapment of multiple battalions that might otherwise have withdrawn to more defensible lines. Meanwhile, Soviet command exploited the gaps forming between German corps. By shifting their axis of attack toward Berdichev and pressing simultaneously on Kazatan to the south, Vatutin's forces achieved operational fluidity. Rybalko's tank armies executed bold flanking maneuvers that bypassed German strongpoints and reached key junctions in the rear. By December 30th, Berdichev itself was under direct assault. Heavy urban fighting erupted as German troops barricaded buildings and transformed city blocks into defensive kill zones. Yet Soviet engineers and assault groups gradually overcame these defenses with systematic use of sappers, mortars, and flamethrowers. The weather, too, played a critical role in shaping the course of operations. While the Soviet advance was slowed by snowdrifts and freezing rain, the Red Army had prepared for these conditions. Winter uniforms, insulated vehicle components, and battlefield medical units reduced attrition. German forces, in contrast, were increasingly suffering from exposure, frostbite, and vehicle malfunctions. The Luftwaffe's reduced operational strength due to weather-grounded most aircraft, denying both reconnaissance and air support at a crucial phase of the campaign. By the first days of January 1944, the initial phase of the Soviet offensive had achieved several of its key objectives. Zhitomir, though not yet fully cleared, was largely isolated. Berdichev's outer defenses had crumbled, and Soviet spearheads were advancing toward Vinnytsia and Shepatovka. German command was forced into reactive and fragmented responses as the operational initiative shifted definitively to the Soviets. The winter counteroffensive, envisioned by the Stavka as part of a broader strategic realignment on the Eastern Front, was unfolding successfully. The battle's next phase would determine whether the Red Army could transform its breakthrough into a sustained rout. The strategic goals of the Jitomir-Berdichev offensive were formulated with precision by the Soviet High Command, reflecting lessons learned from prior operations and the evolving nature of deep battle doctrine. The overarching objective was to disrupt the cohesion of German Army Group South by eliminating its northern flank and driving a wedge between its forces and those of Army Group Center. Capturing key urban centers such as Zhitomir and Berdichev was not an end in itself, but a means of enabling further advances into western Ukraine and threatening the German rear near Vinnytsia and Shepatovka. At the operational level, the First Ukrainian Front was tasked with the destruction of the German 13th and XL Army Corps, while the 13th and 60th Soviet armies were ordered to fix German positions to prevent orderly withdrawals. In parallel, Soviet tank armies, especially the 3rd Guards Tank Army, would exploit breakthroughs and encircle retreating formations. The strategy depended on synchronized attacks across multiple axes, heavy use of artillery to rupture German defensive belts, and rapid mechanized exploitation to disrupt command and supply networks. This doctrine, honed since the early days of the war, now benefited from both experience and logistical maturity. On the German side, strategic planning was marked by increasing desperation and political interference. Field Marshal von Manstein sought to regroup and defend a shorter, more viable line further west, allowing German forces to avoid encirclement and preserve their combat strength. However, Hitler's orders remained inflexible. Zhitomir and Berdichev were to be held at all costs. This led to the commitment of elite formations in piecemeal fashion, often without proper reconnaissance or flank security. The result was not a coherent counteroffensive but a series of disconnected actions that bled strength from already overburdened units. Logistically, the Wehrmacht faced mounting difficulties. The retreat from Kiev and prior fighting around Korostin had left depots depleted and transportation routes compromised. Soviet partisans, operating behind German lines, frequently sabotaged railway lines, ambushed convoys, and severed communications. The German supply network, heavily reliant on rail transport, found itself overstretched and vulnerable. Fuel shortages became particularly acute, limiting the operational radius of panzer divisions and leaving them unable to respond rapidly to changing battlefield conditions. The Soviets, by contrast, had significantly improved their logistical performance by the winter of 1943-44. Rail lines leading to the front were repaired with astonishing speed by specialized railway troops. Mobile repair units and road brigades cleared paths through snowbound terrain, enabling the movement of tanks, fuel, and ammunition. Field hospitals and supply dumps were established within newly captured territories, ensuring that advancing forces could maintain pressure without pausing for resupply. Lend-lease trucks and equipment from the United States played a quiet but vital role in sustaining these logistics chains, allowing Soviet commanders to maintain tempo even in harsh winter conditions. Propaganda played a parallel role in shaping the narrative and morale on both sides. In the Soviet Union, newspapers and radio broadcasts hailed the liberation of Ukrainian towns as proof of national resurgence. Vatutin and Rybalko were lionized as architects of victory, while frontline troops were praised for their courage and tenacity. The framing of the offensive as part of a broader historical mission to free Ukraine from fascist occupation helped galvanize public support and reinforce soldier morale. German propaganda, on the other hand, found itself increasingly disconnected from battlefield realities. Official communiques continued to emphasize heroic resistance and temporary setbacks, avoiding acknowledgement of large-scale retreats or unit losses. This dissonance between official reports and soldier experience contributed to a creeping sense of futility among German troops. For many on the front lines, the winter of 1943-44 brought not just physical hardship, but a growing realization that the war's strategic momentum had shifted irreversibly. As the Soviets refined their offensive, the terrain of the Jitomir-Berdichev region emerged as a critical operational factor. The area was characterized by dense forests, frozen rivers, and marshy lowlands, conditions that traditionally favored the defender. Yet Soviet planners turned these obstacles to their advantage. Pontoon bridges were constructed to cross frozen tributaries, and engineering units cleared paths for tanks through wooded zones. Night attacks were frequently employed to minimize German air observation and to sow confusion among defenders unfamiliar with the local terrain. Preparations for the next phase included the repositioning of artillery for deeper fire missions, the replenishment of mobile fuel reserves, and the forward deployment of infantry divisions to relieve tank crews exhausted from near-continuous engagement. Soviet commanders understood that early gains would amount to little if not followed by consolidation and further exploitation. The doctrine of continuous operations, maintaining pressure without operational pause, was applied ruthlessly. This momentum would soon carry Soviet units to the very gates of Vinnytsia and threaten to destabilize the entire southern wing of the German Eastern Front. As plans solidified and battle lines shifted, one fact became evident to observers on both sides. The Jitomir-Berdichev offensive was not merely a regional battle. It was a critical test of post-Stalingrad strategy, a crucible through which the fate of Ukraine, and perhaps of Eastern Europe, would be decided in the coming months. The first major engagements of the Jitomir-Berdichev offensive unfolded with brutal efficiency. On the morning of December 24, 1943, after a brief but concentrated artillery barrage, Soviet spearheads surged forward across multiple sectors. The 1st Guards Army attacked south of Zhitomir, aiming to outflank the city and sever German escape routes, while the 18th Army and 38th Army pressed hard along the Teterev River. The 3rd Guards Tank Army, operating in coordination, punched through weakly held German positions near Malin and Korostyshev, initiating a wide envelopment maneuver. The early confrontations were characterized by rapid movement and exploitation of German disarray. Soviet tank columns bypassed strong points and targeted junctions, bridges, and supply routes. German units, many of them under strength, poorly supplied, or recently rotated from other sectors, were quickly overwhelmed or forced into disorderly retreat. At Brusilov and Radomischl, German infantry formations were outflanked and collapsed after only hours of resistance. Soviet infantry, closely following armored formations, cleared remnants and secured captured settlements. Civilian populations in newly liberated areas found themselves caught between relief and devastation. Villages along the Zhitomir highway bore the scars of occupation and retreat. In some locations, German rear units had implemented scorched earth tactics, burning buildings, destroying infrastructure, and executing suspected partisans before withdrawal. The Red Army, in turn, often requisitioned local resources for advancing units, further straining populations already exhausted by years of war. Still, many civilians welcomed Soviet troops with cautious hope, recalling the brutality of German occupation policies and forced labor roundups that had marked the prior 2 years. In Jitomir itself, fierce fighting erupted as Soviet units encircled the city from the north and east. German forces under the 13th Army Corps mounted a determined defense, utilizing the city's layout, narrow streets, fortified buildings, and natural river barriers to slow the Soviet advance. House-to-house combat ensued, with German troops establishing firing positions in schools, factories, and administrative buildings. Soviet sappers worked methodically to clear mines and booby traps, while assault groups advanced under cover of smoke and supporting artillery. Despite stubborn resistance, the weight of Soviet firepower and coordination began to tell. By December 29th, Soviet troops had breached Jitomir's inner defenses. German positions around the train station and city center were subjected to intense shelling, and several attempts at organized withdrawal were disrupted by Soviet flanking attacks. Elements of the 1st Panzer Division tried to relieve the city, but were delayed by fuel shortages and partisan sabotage along the Berdichev-Zhitomir rail line. German command efforts to coordinate a counterpunch were hampered by erratic communications and overstretched logistics. To the south, the advance toward Berdichev unfolded in parallel. Here, the terrain favored rapid movement. Open fields and scattered woodlands allowed Soviet mechanized units to exploit their mobility. The 60th and 38th Armies, supported by artillery and air reconnaissance, pushed westward in a broad front. German forces, lacking sufficient reserves, began to fall back under pressure. Defensive lines around Kazatan and Andrushevka disintegrated as command cohesion broke down. In some cases, local commanders abandoned positions entirely rather than face encirclement. Soviet air forces, though limited by weather, played a supporting role. Il-2 ground attack aircraft targeted German convoys and columns retreating along frozen roads. Bombing missions disrupted ammunition depots and destroyed bridges, further complicating German withdrawal efforts. Meanwhile, Soviet logistical teams worked around the clock to repair captured rail lines and bring forward reinforcements. Mobile repair units, truck convoys, and horse-drawn transports flowed behind the front, maintaining the pace of the advance. One of the more unexpected outcomes of the opening battles was the sheer scale of German dislocation. Intelligence estimates had underestimated the vulnerability of German positions west of Kiev. Soviet breakthroughs achieved far deeper penetration than anticipated, creating a sense of operational opportunity within the Stavka. Reports from the front indicated that multiple German formations were retreating without orders, abandoning equipment and leaving rearguards exposed. Soviet commanders, recognizing the fluidity of the situation, pressed their advantage, even at the cost of rising fatigue and overstretched lines. The psychological impact on German troops was considerable. Many had entered Ukraine months earlier during the summer fighting, with expectations of establishing a stabilized defensive front for the winter. Now they found themselves surrounded by destruction, disoriented by rapid advances, and increasingly distrustful of High Command's decisions. Soviet soldiers, by contrast, sensed momentum. Political commissars and officers emphasized the symbolic value of pushing the enemy out of Ukraine's heartland during the new year, linking battlefield success to national revival. By early January 1944, the territorial balance had shifted dramatically. Zhitomir was largely in Soviet hands, with only scattered resistance in its western outskirts. Berdichev, though still contested, was under direct Soviet assault. German defensive positions were collapsing along a wide axis, and command structures were showing signs of systemic failure. With the initial Soviet objectives achieved and momentum still growing, preparations began for the next phase of the offensive, a deeper drive toward Vinnytsia and the potential dismemberment of Army Group South's rear defenses. The Jitomir-Berdichev campaign was entering a new and far more consequential phase. As the offensive entered its second week, the tempo of battle accelerated, and the conflict expanded beyond its initial boundaries. The Soviet High Command, encouraged by the rapid collapse of German defensive lines, ordered a broad escalation of operations. New armies were drawn into the offensive, including the 13th Army and 27th Army, widening the front and increasing pressure on the retreating German formations. The goal was not simply to capture Zhitomir and Berdichev, but to exploit the disintegration of enemy cohesion and force a strategic collapse in the right bank Ukraine sector. German command attempted to stabilize the front through hurried redeployments and fragmented counterattacks. Field Marshal von Manstein, under intense pressure from Hitler to hold key positions, committed remaining reserves, including the understrength 7th Panzer Division and remnants of the 25th Panzer Grenadier Division. These units were thrown into the path of the advancing Soviets in an attempt to delay or halt their momentum. However, piecemeal deployment and logistical breakdowns severely hampered their effectiveness. German forces found themselves unable to mount a coordinated defense, and local counterstrikes often resulted in further losses without strategic gain. Weather conditions during the first weeks of January added a new layer of complexity. Temperatures plunged well below freezing, and snowstorms blanketed the region, making road movement treacherous and aerial operations nearly impossible. For both sides, the terrain became an unforgiving adversary. Tanks froze in place, rifles malfunctioned, and supply convoys stalled in snowdrifts. Soviet troops, better equipped for winter warfare, maintained their advance, though at a slower pace. German formations, suffering from inadequate winter clothing and declining morale, were increasingly unable to hold their positions or respond effectively to Soviet maneuvers. Terrain further challenged command and control. The region's forests, rivers, and marshes fragmented the battlefield and isolated German units. Many formations became encircled or cut off without immediate awareness from their higher commands. Retreats often devolved into disorganized flights, with soldiers abandoning equipment to move faster through icy fields and ravines. In several documented cases, German battalions attempted to break out of encirclements independently, only to be destroyed by waiting Soviet artillery or ambushes laid by partisans. The casualty rates on both sides rose sharply. Soviet rifle divisions, though advancing, paid a high price for every village and river crossing. German artillery, when intact and supplied, remained deadly. Defensive positions around Berdichev and Kazatin, hastily prepared but effectively utilized, inflicted significant losses before being overrun. Hospital trains and field medical stations struggled to cope with the volume of wounded. The sheer scale of the fighting strained every echelon of the Soviet rear services. Meanwhile, German medical infrastructure was collapsing under the weight of battlefield casualties, frostbite cases, and mounting supply shortfalls. The breakdown in German morale became increasingly visible. Desertions rose sharply, particularly among rear echelon troops and units composed of conscripts from occupied territories. Soviet interrogation of captured soldiers revealed growing fatalism and bitterness toward command decisions. At the same time, Soviet propaganda broadcasts and leaflets targeted German troops, offering amnesty to those who surrendered and emphasizing the futility of continued resistance. Although mass surrenders were rare, small groups did abandon their positions and attempt to reach Soviet lines, particularly in encircled areas. Political tensions within the German command structure added to the crisis. Hitler's refusal to allow tactical withdrawals or realistic reconfiguration of lines led to repeated failures to adapt to Soviet breakthroughs. Field commanders found themselves caught between the operational realities on the ground and the ideological demands of the Nazi leadership. Manstein, who favored elastic defense and mobile counterattacks, found his proposals routinely rejected or delayed. Orders from Berlin emphasized symbolic locations rather than operational logic, turning places like Berdichev into costly traps for defending forces. On the Soviet side, coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery improved with each passing day. Lessons from earlier operations were applied in real time. Communications networks, including radio and field telephone lines, were rapidly extended into forward areas. Supply columns, though slowed by weather, maintained a consistent flow of ammunition, fuel, and rations. Mobile command posts kept pace with the front lines, allowing generals like Vatutin and Rybalko to direct operations closely and respond swiftly to battlefield developments. The expansion of the front also brought increasing civilian suffering. Villages caught in the crossfire were often destroyed by artillery or set ablaze during German withdrawals. Food stores were requisitioned by both sides and livestock slaughtered to feed advancing troops. Thousands of civilians fled westward alongside retreating German units or hid in forests and ruins. Soviet authorities, upon re-entering liberated areas, moved to re-establish local administration and restore order. But the scale of destruction often made this impossible in the short term. Refugees overwhelmed field hospitals, while starvation and disease loomed in areas cut off from supply lines. By mid-January 1944, the offensive had reached its crisis point. The German front was nearing total collapse in the Jitomir-Berdichev sector. Soviet forces were now threatening Vinnytsia and the rear of Army Group South. Despite desperate countermeasures and the arrival of scattered reinforcements, German positions continued to disintegrate under relentless pressure. The operational window for any meaningful counteroffensive had closed. The campaign, born as a tactical thrust west of Kiev, had escalated into a strategic disaster for the Wehrmacht. The Red Army, bloodied but unrelenting, stood poised to exploit the breakthrough and continue its advance deeper into occupied territory. By the third week of January 1944, the Jitomir-Berdichev operation had reached its peak intensity. Soviet forces, having broken through the main lines of the German 4th Panzer Army, now surged forward into the depths of right-bank Ukraine. What began as a winter counteroffensive to solidify gains west of Kiev had transformed into a campaign of annihilation aimed at collapsing the enemy's operational structure. The largest engagements of the operation now unfolded as both sides committed everything they had left to either achieve a breakthrough or halt total collapse. The fiercest fighting centered around Berdichev and the surrounding towns of Andrushevka, Popilnya, and Kosyatin. Berdichev, a critical transportation hub and garrison city, became the focus of German efforts to delay the Soviet advance long enough to extract remaining units. Here, elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte, and remnants of the 68th and 75th Infantry Divisions attempted to hold a shrinking perimeter against relentless Soviet pressure. The 18th Army and 38th Army, supported by the 3rd Guards Tank Army, encircled the city from 3 directions, cutting off supply lines and preventing reinforcements from arriving. Urban combat inside Berdichev was among the most brutal of the campaign. Soviet sappers cleared minefields and booby-trapped buildings block by block, while flamethrower teams flushed out German machine gun nests hidden in basements and courtyards. Tanks moved cautiously through the narrow, debris-filled streets, firing point-blank into defensive positions. German soldiers, many of whom had no hope of reinforcement or withdrawal, fought with desperation. Yet by January 5th, the last organized German defenses in the city had collapsed. Thousands were killed or captured, and Berdichev was firmly under Soviet control. Elsewhere, the battle reached equally intense levels. At Kazatin, an important railway junction, Soviet forces overwhelmed the German defenders after a 3-day struggle marked by heavy artillery duels and continuous infantry assaults. Kazatin's fall severed one of the last major east-west supply lines available to Army Group South, further isolating German units to the north. In the surrounding countryside, German rearguards attempted to establish delaying positions but were quickly overrun or outflanked by Soviet mobile detachments. The decisions made at the highest levels of command during this period proved decisive. General Vatutin pushed his commanders to continue forward without pause, knowing that momentum was the Red Army's greatest asset. Resupply was maintained by an enormous logistical effort. Rail lines were repaired as fast as they were captured. Horse-drawn carts delivered fuel and food over frozen rivers, and engineers constructed makeshift bridges for tanks to cross marshes and canals. The Soviet capacity to sustain large-scale offensive operations in winter conditions had reached a level of efficiency unimaginable earlier in the war. German commanders, meanwhile, found their options narrowing. Hitler's refusal to authorize tactical withdrawals meant that divisions were often left in exposed positions until they were destroyed or encircled. The few counterattacks that were launched, such as those near Vinnytsia and south of Shepatovka, lacked coordination, armor strength, or air support. German high command remained paralyzed by unrealistic directives and internal disputes, unable to create a coherent plan to salvage the situation. Air operations, though sporadic due to weather, still played a critical role. Soviet ground attack aircraft flew in low to target German convoys retreating along icy roads. The Il-2 Sturmovik, in particular, proved effective in disrupting enemy columns, destroying fuel trucks, and harassing rear units. German air response was minimal, as the Luftwaffe had neither the resources nor the airfields to sustain meaningful support. Soviet air superiority, even in limited windows, helped to paralyze the enemy's ability to regroup or maneuver effectively. Civilian suffering also reached its zenith during this phase of the operation. Entire villages were reduced to ruins by shelling or deliberately destroyed by retreating German troops. Mass executions of suspected partisans occurred in areas like Popilnya and Berdichev Rayon. Thousands of civilians fled their homes, creating streams of refugees heading in every direction. Soviet field authorities struggled to establish order, provide food, or prevent reprisals against suspected collaborators. The scale of humanitarian breakdown was enormous, with disease and starvation taking root in the wake of the advancing front. The psychological toll on both sides was profound. Soviet troops, though advancing, showed signs of exhaustion and trauma from the relentless pace of combat and the horrors witnessed in recently liberated areas. German units, often isolated and surrounded, displayed increasing signs of collapse. Desertions, self-inflicted wounds, and chaotic withdrawals became common. Entire battalions disintegrated under pressure, their officers killed or captured, their men surrendering or fleeing in small groups through forests and fields. By January 10, 1944, the Soviet advance had reached its deepest penetration yet. The First Ukrainian Front stood within striking distance of Vinnytsia, and forward elements probed toward Shepatovka and Starokonstantinov. What had begun as a regional thrust now threatened the operational rear of Army Group South. German command recognized the growing danger of encirclement for units still positioned further east, including those in the Korsun area. Yet even with this awareness, the rigidity of strategic thinking in Berlin prevented meaningful adaptation. The Jitomir-Berdichev operation had reached its most decisive phase. The Red Army had shattered 2 German army corps, captured key urban centers, and ruptured the cohesion of an entire segment of the German front. Losses on both sides were staggering, but it was the Wehrmacht that suffered most. The road west lay open, and the question now was not whether the Soviets would advance, but how far and how fast. The psychological and material collapse of German forces in this sector marked one of the clearest signs yet that the tide of war in the east had irreversibly turned. With the major objectives of the Jitomir-Berdichev operation secured, Soviet forces transitioned from breakthrough to exploitation, but they quickly encountered new challenges. The momentum that had carried the Red Army across rivers, through forests, and into fortified cities began to waver under the strain of overextended lines, deteriorating weather, and the sheer exhaustion of men and machines. Yet even as Soviet formations reached the limits of their advance, they were forced to adapt, countering German resistance, adjusting tactics, and maintaining pressure without overcommitting vulnerable spearheads. German high command, reeling from the collapse of the 4th Panzer Army's front, scrambled to erect new defensive lines west and southwest of Berdichev. These makeshift positions, anchored around towns like Vinnytsia and Starokonstantinov, relied heavily on terrain and whatever units could be salvaged from the retreat. Though many of these formations were weakened, their morale shattered, and their numbers reduced, they still posed a threat, especially in localized counterattacks. German infantry used forests and frozen rivers to launch ambushes on Soviet flanks, aiming to delay the advance and buy time for a broader regrouping. In response, Soviet commanders shifted from deep penetrations to stabilizing their gains and fending off counterthrusts. Defensive strategies were deployed at multiple levels. Infantry dug into frozen ground to create field fortifications. Artillery units were repositioned to guard supply lines and crossroads, while engineers laid mines and constructed barriers around key forward positions. The Red Army, having learned painful lessons during earlier overextensions in 1941 and 1942, now moved with greater caution, understanding that a successful breakthrough meant little if the flanks remained vulnerable. At the tactical level, local commanders showed increasing sophistication. Units began rotating frontline troops to rest and rearm, improving combat endurance. Assault groups that had previously spearheaded urban battles were reassigned to rear areas for recovery. Partisan detachments, many of whom had been operating behind German lines for months, were now integrated into regular Soviet reconnaissance and security operations. These fighters provided valuable intelligence on German troop movements, helped prevent enemy infiltration, and protected key logistical routes. One of the most significant adaptations was the Red Army's approach to resource management. Supply officers faced immense difficulties transporting fuel, ammunition, and food across a devastated landscape. Roads remained blocked by wreckage and snow, and air resupply was limited by weather. Yet through a combination of ingenuity and sheer determination, Soviet logistics personnel managed to maintain a basic flow of essentials to the front. Mobile workshops and depots were established in captured towns. Captured German vehicles were repaired and pressed into service, and horses once again played a critical role in hauling supplies where trucks could not go. Improvisation also extended to the battlefield. In some sectors, Soviet tanks outpaced infantry and were left vulnerable. To bridge this gap, commanders formed ad hoc motorized infantry groups, using requisitioned civilian vehicles and captured trucks to rush troops forward. These mobile units, though lightly equipped, enabled rapid consolidation of gains and helped secure key junctions before the Germans could mount a response. In other cases, Soviet artillery units were leapfrogged forward in stages, ensuring continuous fire support during mobile engagements. Psychologically, both sides were entering a new phase of strain. For Soviet troops, the elation of recapturing Ukrainian territory began to give way to exhaustion and trauma. Many were witnessing firsthand the effects of occupation: burned villages, mass graves, and survivors scarred by years of repression. Political officers and unit leaders worked constantly to maintain morale, using battlefield successes and patriotic rhetoric to steel their soldiers for the next phase of the war. Yet the toll of unbroken combat, freezing nights, and mounting casualties could not be ignored. German troops, though offered occasional success in delaying actions, were increasingly demoralized. The loss of Berdichev and the failure to stabilize a winter line west of Zhitomir left many with the realization that the Red Army would not be stopped by weather, terrain, or limited reinforcements. Soldiers who had once believed in the possibility of holding Ukraine now faced a grim new reality: retreat into Poland or destruction in place. Still, experienced German officers managed to impose temporary order, organizing hedgehog defenses and conducting rearguard actions with remarkable discipline under the circumstances. Resistance also emerged in a different form, through the growing activity of Ukrainian partisans. Though their loyalties and affiliations varied, many groups used the chaos of the front to step up attacks on retreating German units. Bridges were destroyed, rail lines sabotaged, and supply columns ambushed in areas believed to be behind the lines. Soviet military intelligence began coordinating more closely with these groups, assigning them roles in disrupting enemy communications and isolating pockets of resistance. In some areas, partisan attacks directly contributed to the encirclement or disorientation of German formations. By late January 1944, the Red Army had consolidated its territorial gains from the Jitomir-Berdichev offensive. The front had shifted significantly westward, but the fighting had entered a grinding, attritional phase. Soviet units prepared for renewed offensives toward Vinnytsia, Proskurov, and beyond. While the initial lightning pace of the campaign had slowed, its strategic consequences were already becoming clear. The Germans had lost their hold on northern right-bank Ukraine, and their ability to mount coherent resistance in the region had been permanently impaired. The battlefield was no longer defined by sweeping maneuvers alone. It had become a proving ground of adaptation, endurance, and resolve. The turning point of the Jitomir-Berdichev operation came not with a single decisive clash, but through the cumulative collapse of the German defensive structure under relentless Soviet pressure. By late January 1944, the fragmentation of German lines, combined with the exhaustion of reserves, logistical paralysis, and command dysfunction, created the conditions for a decisive shift in momentum. Soviet forces, despite cold, fatigue, and the inherent risks of winter campaigning, capitalized on the opportunity. Their steady, grinding advance transitioned into a broader unraveling of German control across right-bank Ukraine. The most critical development occurred along the flanks of the 4th Panzer Army, where repeated Soviet penetrations finally broke the last remaining cohesion between the German 13 and Exelfen Army Corps. These formations, already mauled by weeks of attrition and encirclements, began to disintegrate under renewed attacks. In sectors such as Vinnytsia's northern approaches and the Shepativka rail corridor, German resistance collapsed entirely. Units surrendered en masse, retreated chaotically without orders, or simply vanished from communication networks. By January 25th, Soviet reconnaissance units were reporting no organized defense lines west of Kazatan and north of Berdichev. It was here that the Stavka saw its opportunity to widen the breach. Orders were issued for a rapid follow-on offensive toward Proskurov and Vinnytsia, with the objective of cutting off retreating German forces from the southern Dniester River region. Mobile groups from the 3rd Guards Tank Army and 1st Guards Cavalry Corps were tasked with striking deep into the rear, targeting rail hubs, depots, and headquarters. The German rear echelon, previously protected by distance and secondary reserves, now found itself exposed and vulnerable. Fuel trains were captured, communication lines severed, and retreating columns harassed by artillery and airstrikes. Perhaps the clearest expression of this turning point came in the failed German attempts to organize a counteroffensive to retake Berdichev. The operation, assembled hastily under orders from Berlin, involved battered elements of the 1st SS Panzer and 7th Panzer Divisions. These units, already depleted and operating on minimal fuel and ammunition, launched their assault from forested positions west of Zhitomir. Soviet forces, anticipating the move, had fortified their new lines and reinforced them with anti-tank units and artillery concentrations. The counterattack stalled almost immediately, suffering heavy casualties and accomplishing nothing beyond further weakening elite German formations. The collapse of German command cohesion accelerated. Reports from intercepted communications and captured staff officers revealed growing confusion within Army Group South's headquarters. Hitler continued to issue contradictory orders, demanding that Berdichev be recaptured, forbidding retreat from Kazatan, and insisting that the front be held without consideration for the actual operational picture. Field Marshal Manstein, increasingly sidelined, attempted to coordinate an orderly withdrawal but lacked the authority or means to enforce his plans. Commanders in the field were left to improvise, often defying orders to preserve what little combat strength they had left. For the Soviet command, the turning point was not simply a military achievement. It was confirmation of the Red Army's full recovery from its early war disasters. The success of coordinated multi-arm offensives, the performance of deep penetration units, and the logistical capacity to sustain movement in winter proved that Soviet operational art had reached a new level of maturity. Generals like Vatutin and Rybalko demonstrated the ability not only to execute Stavka plans, but to adapt dynamically as conditions changed. The Red Army was no longer reactive. It had become the architect of the battlefield. The consequences for German strategy were profound. The destruction of 2 corps, The loss of Jitomir and Berdichev and the exposure of Vinnitsa meant that the entire southern wing of the Eastern Front was now unstable. Army Group A, operating in southern Ukraine and the Crimea, faced the prospect of encirclement if Soviet advances continued unchecked. Supply lines from the Romanian border were increasingly threatened, and the Black Sea ports risked becoming isolated. For the first time, the German war effort in Ukraine appeared not just endangered but strategically untenable. Civilian authorities under German occupation also fled in disarray. Records seized by Soviet forces in Berdichev and Kazatan revealed frantic efforts to evacuate administrative personnel, destroy incriminating documents, and transport collaborators and looted assets westward. Many were caught by the speed of the Soviet advance, and dozens of local administrators were captured or killed. The remnants of the occupation infrastructure, police, Gestapo units, and supply offices ceased to function entirely in liberated zones. The Axis grip on Ukrainian civil society had collapsed alongside its military defense. By the end of January, the battlefield told the story plainly. German trenches lay abandoned or shattered, supply depots burned, and equipment wrecks dotted roads and fields. Soviet flags flew over city halls and railway stations where swastikas had hung days before. The front had moved westward, but more importantly, the character of the war had changed. The Wehrmacht was no longer capable of setting the pace. The Red Army now dictated where and when battles would be fought. The Jitomir-Berdichev operation had not only redrawn the map, it had redrawn the balance of power on the Eastern Front. As combat operations subsided across the Jitomir-Berdichev sector in early February 1944, the Red Army began the difficult task of consolidating its victories and managing the chaotic aftermath of a shattered front. While the offensive officially concluded with the full liberation of the Berdichev region and the rout of German forces west of the Teterev River, the consequences of the campaign extended far beyond its immediate tactical gains. What followed was a period of urgent regrouping, mass recovery efforts, and political reassertion in a region scarred by years of brutal occupation and weeks of unrelenting combat. German forces, reeling from the collapse of their defenses, attempted a general withdrawal to new positions near the Bug and Dniester rivers. The retreat, however, was neither orderly nor consistent. Many divisions had lost their cohesion entirely. Rearguard elements attempted to hold crossings and delay Soviet pursuit, but their capacity was limited by exhaustion, disrupted communications, and a lack of heavy equipment. The losses sustained during the offensive were staggering. Dozens of battalion command posts had ceased to function, hundreds of tanks and vehicles were abandoned or destroyed, and tens of thousands of casualties had gutted entire regiments. For many German units, the withdrawal was a desperate flight through snow-covered roads and ruined villages, pursued by Soviet forward detachments and harassed by partisans. Among the German wounded and stragglers, confusion reigned. With field hospitals overwhelmed or overrun, makeshift aid stations were set up in barns, schoolhouses, and railway carriages. Medical evacuation was nearly impossible in many cases. Food was scarce, and ammunition stocks had been largely expended during the final days of the campaign. Thousands of soldiers were taken prisoner, many captured in small groups after their units dissolved. Others simply surrendered, too demoralized and frostbitten to resist further. For the Wehrmacht, the aftermath of Jitomir-Berdichev resembled not a tactical setback, but the disintegration of a fighting army in retreat. On the Soviet side, the Red Army faced the immense logistical and humanitarian challenges of post-offensive stabilization. Rear service units moved in behind the advancing fronts to repair roads, restore communication lines, and clear minefields. Military tribunals were dispatched to re-establish Soviet authority and identify collaborators. Field kitchens and mobile bakeries followed the troops to feed the returning civilian populations, many of whom had been without supplies for weeks. The NKVD arrived shortly thereafter, tasked with screening local populations, investigating war crimes, and reasserting political control over liberated areas. The physical devastation of the region was immense. Whole towns had been reduced to rubble by artillery and aerial bombardment. Rail yards lay twisted and burnt, roads were cratered and frozen, and bridges had been dynamited by retreating German engineers. Entire villages were uninhabitable. The winter landscape was littered with the debris of war, scorched vehicles, shattered tanks, and the bodies of fallen soldiers and civilians. Burial details moved through the countryside to recover and inter the dead, while engineers dismantled unexploded ordnance and salvaged what they could from the ruined infrastructure. Civilians who had survived the occupation and the battle emerged into a world transformed. The Red Army's arrival marked liberation for some, but for many the suffering continued. Homes had been looted or destroyed. Livestock was gone. Fields were mined or churned to mud by the tracks of tanks and artillery. Families were divided. Some had fled, others had died, and many remained missing. The return of Soviet authority also brought its own anxieties. Suspicion, investigations, and the forced collectivization of land and property loomed over the countryside. Political officers reminded civilians of their duty to the state, while local party organs were re-established in the ruins of administrative buildings. Among the most urgent priorities was the resumption of rail traffic. Berdichev and Zhitomir had served as critical logistical nodes before and during the campaign, and their reactivation was essential for supplying ongoing operations toward Vinnytsia and beyond. Soviet railway troops worked tirelessly to restore lines, rebuild stations, and reconnect the shattered region to the broader wartime network. Armored trains once again rolled through the countryside, carrying reinforcements, engineers, and supplies to the new front. For Soviet units that had borne the brunt of the fighting, the aftermath brought only limited respite. The Stavka issued orders for regrouping and preparation for future offensives toward the southern Bug River and the Romanian frontier. Fresh troops and equipment were sent forward, and many frontline units were rotated to the rear for brief rest and refitting. Awards were distributed to outstanding formations, and commanders were praised for their roles in the campaign. Yet celebrations were muted. The cost had been enormous, and the winter war was not yet over. As for the German command, the consequences of the defeat were immediate. Army Group South's credibility suffered a critical blow, and command disputes intensified. Field Marshal Manstein submitted repeated requests to withdraw and reconfigure defenses, but his influence with Hitler had waned. In March 1944, he would be dismissed from command entirely. The loss of the Jitomir-Berdichev line exposed the southern front to deeper Soviet penetration and contributed directly to the encirclement battles that would soon follow in the Korsun Pocket and the Uman-Botosani operation. The Battle of Jitomir-Berdichev thus concluded with far more than territorial shifts. It signaled the effective collapse of German strategic capacity in northern Ukraine and set the stage for the cascading defeats that would drive the Wehrmacht out of Soviet territory entirely. For the Red Army, the campaign marked another milestone on the road to final victory. For the civilians who lived through it, it left behind a shattered land, one that would take years to recover, even as the war pressed onward without pause. The legacy of the Jitomir-Berdichev operation would resonate long after the snow-covered fields of central Ukraine fell silent. Though overshadowed by larger and more infamous campaigns such as Stalingrad and Kursk, this winter offensive played a pivotal role in reshaping the strategic balance on the Eastern Front. It marked not only the liberation of critical territory, but also the irreversible decline of German military dominance in Ukraine. In both Soviet and German historical memory, the operation stood as a testament to the shifting momentum of a war that had entered its final punishing phase. Strategically, the operation dealt a crippling blow to Army Group South. The destruction of two corps, the loss of Zhitomir and Berdichev, and the collapse of a continuous front line in northern right bank Ukraine forced the German High Command into a reactive posture. Never again would the Wehrmacht be able to mount a large-scale strategic offensive in this sector. With each successive Red Army advance, German forces would be pushed further into a defensive war of attrition. Bleeding men, machines, and morale they could no longer afford to lose. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, emerged from the operation with increased confidence and growing prestige. The ability to plan and execute a winter campaign on this scale, through inhospitable terrain and against fortified opposition, demonstrated the maturity of the Red Army's evolving operational doctrine. Coordination between fronts, use of mobile exploitation units, and efficient logistics under adverse conditions all reflected a military force that had undergone deep transformation since the disasters of 1941. The victory bolstered not only the Red Army's strategic position, but also the morale of a population yearning for retribution and liberation. Politically, the operation reinforced Soviet control over newly liberated areas of Ukraine. The NKVD moved swiftly to reassert state authority, conducting purges of suspected collaborators and re-establishing party structures in towns and villages. Propaganda framed the victory as a triumph of the Soviet people and the righteous reclamation of their homeland. Statues were erected, streets renamed, and schools reopened under strict ideological supervision. The operation thus became part of a broader effort to reconstruct Soviet identity in the wake of Nazi occupation and wartime devastation. In post-war narratives, particularly within the Soviet Union, the Battle of Jitomir-Berdichev was remembered as a model of successful winter warfare and deep offensive strategy. Military academies studied its tactics. Veterans were decorated for their bravery. In Ukrainian memory, the operation held a more complex place, viewed simultaneously as liberation from one brutal regime and the return of another. For many civilians, the scars left by years of war and shifting occupations remained long after flags had changed and front lines had moved on. German military historians, in post-war analysis, identified the operation as part of the broader collapse of coherence on the Eastern Front. Failures in logistics, intelligence, and high-level command were scrutinized as symptoms of a war effort increasingly out of touch with battlefield realities. The loss of Army Group South's northern positions, coupled with the erosion of elite divisions in futile counterattacks, signaled the end of German hopes to stabilize the situation in Ukraine. In subsequent months, the Wehrmacht would retreat from one crisis to another, first in Korsun, then in the Carpathians, and finally into Poland and the Balkans. The terrain of the Jitomir-Berdichev front bore the evidence of its significance. Long after the war, trenches, bunkers, and rusting wreckage dotted the countryside. Monuments were erected by the Soviet state to commemorate fallen soldiers, often inscribed with slogans exalting sacrifice and unity. Veterans returned to visit the towns they had liberated or defended. In local museums and archives, faded photographs and battlefield relics preserved the memory of a campaign that had reshaped a region and contributed to the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany. Today, the Jitomir-Berdichev operation is studied by military historians as an important example of successful Soviet winter campaigning. It illustrates the integration of combined arms tactics, the value of strategic initiative, and the consequences of rigid command in the face of mobile, flexible opposition. It also highlights the human cost of total war: tens of thousands of lives lost, communities destroyed, and landscapes transformed by fire and steel. Ultimately, the battle's legacy lies not only in the redrawn maps or the statistics of captured towns and prisoners. It lies in its contribution to the unbroken chain of offensives that, by 1945, would carry the Red Army all the way to Berlin. Zhitomir and Berdichev, once symbols of occupation and resistance, had become milestones on the road to victory. And in the snow and silence they left behind, history recorded not just a military campaign, but a nation's long and bitter journey back from the brink.